The United States has lost the weapon that made its power. For roughly 3 decades after the Cold War, American power enjoyed a distinctive multiplier: the ability to transform global economic infrastructure into an instrument of statecraft. This power did not rest solely on military superiority, alliance systems, or technological leadership. It was anchored in a financial and legal architecture that the world used by default because it was efficient, liquid, and widely trusted. When Washington chose to exert pressure, it could often do so without deploying troops, relying instead on access to dollar clearing, the reach of its legal jurisdiction, the compliance obligations of global banks, and the extraterritorial nature of its sanctions regime. In this sense, the true weapon was not simply the dollar as a currency, nor SWIFT as a technical network, nor sanctions as a diplomatic signal. It was the fusion of monetary centrality, financial plumbing, and legal reach into a coercive capability that could operate globally and at scale. To argue that the United States has now lost this weapon may appear exaggerated. The dollar remains the world's dominant reserve currency. It continues to underpin global trade invoicing, financial intermediation, and safe asset demand. No rival currency matches the depth, liquidity, and institutional trust embedded in U.S. financial markets. From this perspective, American financial power appears intact. Yet power is not defined only by dominance in absolute terms. It is defined by leverage, the ability to translate position into outcomes. The more precise question is whether the United States can still convert its financial centrality into predictable, coercive results at an acceptable strategic cost. On this narrower but more consequential point, the evidence increasingly suggests erosion rather than continuity. The weapon still exists, but it no longer functions as it once did. It is heavier to wield, less decisive in effect, and more likely to provoke countermeasures that diminish its future effectiveness. Understanding this shift requires clarity about why the weapon worked so well in the first place. Modern financial coercion operates less through physical interdiction than through balance sheet risk. Because the dollar is embedded at the core of global finance, and because most major banks depend on access to U.S.-linked correspondent networks, Washington can shape behavior by altering risk calculations. The threat of exclusion from dollar markets, or of legal penalties under U.S. jurisdiction, often induces preemptive compliance. Secondary sanctions amplify this effect by extending U.S. influence beyond its borders, forcing even non-American firms to choose between access to U.S. markets and engagement with sanctioned entities. This system was most effective when 3 conditions held simultaneously. First, alternatives were scarce. Exclusion from dollar finance meant near total isolation. Second, U.S. actions were perceived as exceptional and rules-based, reducing incentives to build parallel systems. Third, the political and economic costs imposed on allies and neutral states remained tolerable, preserving coalition cohesion. Each of these conditions has weakened. The first erosion is infrastructural. Alternatives, while incomplete, have multiplied. States that view U.S. financial power as a strategic vulnerability have invested in parallel payment systems, domestic clearing mechanisms, and non-Western financial networks. These systems do not replace the dollar-dominated architecture, but they provide partial insulation. Even limited insulation matters. Financial coercion depends on shock. When exclusion becomes survival rather than catastrophic, its deterrent value declines. Crucially, the strategic problem is not substitution, but redundancy. States and firms no longer need a perfect alternative to dollar finance. They need only enough capacity to reduce exposure. Once the cost of building partial alternatives falls below the expected cost of future coercion, rational actors invest. Over time, the cumulative effect is to dilute the centrality that made the weapon decisive. The second erosion concerns legitimacy and trust. A global currency is not sustained by force alone. It rests on the belief that access will not be arbitrarily politicized. The more frequently financial infrastructure is weaponized, the more actors begin to price in political risk. Even those not currently targeted must consider the possibility that geopolitical shifts could place them on the wrong side of future sanctions. This dynamic became especially visible when sovereign assets were frozen on a large scale, and when public debate emerged around the repurposing of foreign exchange reserves for political objectives. Regardless of the legal merits of specific cases, the signal was clear: reserve assets held within U.S.-aligned jurisdictions are conditional. For reserve managers, this does not mandate a sudden abandonment of the dollar, but it strengthens incentives for gradual diversification into assets perceived as politically safer or harder to immobilize. The result is not a collapse of dollar dominance, but a steady rebalancing. Marginal shifts matter because coercive power depends on concentration. When financial flows are highly centralized, exclusion is devastating. When they are moderately diversified, exclusion becomes costly but manageable. The third erosion is strategic and political. Sanctions are most effective when objectives are limited, enforcement is credible, and compliance is clearly preferable to defiance. Over time, sanctions have been used more frequently and for broader goals. sometimes as instruments of moral signaling rather than realistic policy change. This expansion has reduced their marginal effectiveness. Targets adapt. They develop evasion strategies, reroute trade through intermediaries, cultivate alternative partners, and normalize life under sanctions. Meanwhile, sanctioning states absorb collateral costs in the form of higher energy prices, supply chain disruptions, and diplomatic friction. As these costs rise, sustaining political consensus becomes harder, particularly among allies whose interests do not fully align with Washington's. Sanctions thus generate a learning process on both sides. The more often they are applied without decisive outcomes, the more sophisticated evasion becomes. Financial coercion shifts from a decisive instrument to a prolonged contest of adaptation. A further complication lies in technological change. Digital assets and decentralized networks do not replace traditional finance, but they introduce leakage into sanctions regimes. They allow some actors to move value outside conventional channels, even if at higher cost and risk. This forces sanctioning authorities into a continual cycle of enforcement and adaptation, further reducing the efficiency of coercion. None of this implies that the dollar is on the verge of displacement. Its incumbency advantages remain formidable. U.S. financial markets are unmatched in scale and liquidity. No alternative currency offers the same combination of openness, legal predictability, and institutional depth. Even the most skeptical analyses tend to conclude that any transition away from dollar centrality would be gradual rather than abrupt. But dominance and leverage are not the same. The United States still sits at the center of the system, yet its ability to translate that position into automatic compliance has diminished. Where coercion once worked almost by default, it now requires sustained coalition management, careful calibration, and acceptance of higher strategic costs. This creates a structural contradiction. The dollar functions as a global public good precisely because it is widely available and trusted. But a public good loses credibility when access is frequently conditioned on political alignment. The more the United States leans on financial coercion, the more it undermines the very trust that sustains its monetary primacy. The emerging global order, therefore, is not one of clean replacement. It is a pluralizing system. The dollar remains first among unequals, but its exclusivity is weakening. Trade settlement diversifies at the margins. Reserves diversify incrementally. Financial messaging and clearing acquire regional redundancies. None of these changes alone overturn U.S. power. Together, they reduce its sharpest edge. In practical terms, the United States can still impose severe pressure on smaller, highly exposed economies. It can still disrupt firms dependent on Western finance. But against large states with strategic depth and diversified trade relationships, outcomes are less predictable. Financial pressure inflicts pain, but pain no longer guarantees compliance. This shift also alters alliance politics. Extraterritorial enforcement and secondary sanctions generate resentment and encourage allies to seek protective mechanisms. Even when objectives are shared, methods become contested. Financial power that once unified coalitions increasingly strains them. If the United States has lost anything, it is not capability but automaticity. In the past, the threat of exclusion often sufficed because defiance was irrational. Today, defiance is costly but sometimes survivable. The weapon still fires, but it no longer ensures submission. Each use accelerates adaptation, reducing its future effectiveness. In that sense, the loss is structural. The United States has lost the monopoly on the conditions that made financial coercion decisive. Power remains, but it is more conditional, more negotiated, and more fragile. In a fragmented world, financial dominance no longer guarantees control. It becomes one instrument among others, potent but constrained, influential but no longer decisive on its own. This is not the end of American power. It is a transformation in how power operates. The United States remains a central node in the global system, but it is no longer the uncontested architect of its rules. In such an environment, financial coercion evolves from a hammer into a bargaining chip, still dangerous, still consequential, but insufficient by itself to shape the world as it once did.